Age of Sigmar. Rarely if ever has there been a war game with as volatile a reputation as this one. Born from the corpse of fantasy after GW took it behind the shed, this game's never been able to fully escape from the end times and the garbage reputation that naturally gave it. The fact the first edition was kinda crap from my understanding didn't help much either. Which is a shame, because it's a fun game with a fun setting that's only been growing since its inception. Ever since 2015, Age of Sigmar has gone from the surprised adopted child no one else in the family liked to a bearer of the name Warhammer that has earned it. Once you get past Age of Sigmar and fantasy fans being at each other's throats, you find realms of endless wonder, terror, and some of the best damn models GW has ever produced. The factions in this setting are hugely varied, yes with the classic elves, dwarves, and orcs, but portraying them in ways unlike anyone else. So how about we talk about them? From the grandest of alliances to the weird fish people that like to steal your souls, let's go over the factions that exist in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. As with anything, some of them are masterfully done and even people outside of AOS's fanbase love them. Others are the Fyreslayers. But all of them are worth talking about, so today, come with me on a journey across the mortal realms on this overview of all the armies in Age of Sigmar you can use to beat people over the head with. But before we begin, would you like to know where to get some quality audio just in time for the holiday season? If so, I've got just the thing for you, because this message is sponsored by Raycon. Regular earbuds sit in your ears and totally block out all sound, but Raycon's essential open earbuds sit right outside your ear canal, which means that while you get the clearest audio quality you can ask for, you can still hear the world around you just fine. They're light and the earhook rotates, so there's no problem keeping them in, meaning you can take them wherever you want. Go to the gym, for a walk, to the store. Wherever you go, these bad boys will be just fine. With over 3 million customers, Raycon clearly has a satisfied audience, and at half the price you get sound quality just as good as other brands. It's a steal for what you're getting. Ever since getting them, these are my go-to headphones when I'm doing some writing. If a package comes by or my dog starts barking, I'll know, and the whole time I'm getting some premium grade audio. The essential open earbuds are here for the holiday season, and they're selling fast. Raycon audio products are up to 20% off this holiday season. Just click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/pancreasnoworkopen to save on Raycon audio products site-wide. Order by December 15th to guarantee delivery by Christmas, because great gifts shouldn't show up late. To get quality earphones, you can do no better than Raycon, so grab yourself a pair just in time for the holidays. Now then, time to jump through a realm gate and murder whatever's on the other side of it. The short of Age of Sigmar's history can be summed up as everyone going, world blew up, now what, and going from there. As the setting progressed, all of the factions eventually grouped together into the grand alliances you can find in the setting, and indeed how the armies are grouped on the web store. For reference, it's kind of like World of Warcraft if you're one of those poor souls who's poured thousands of hours into that game, although in AOS's case there's 4 alliances instead of 2. Membership in a grand alliance isn't really a thing, and oftentimes the people in one hate each other as much as they hate the people out of one, but based on the themes of certain armies you can end up grouping them into one of these 4 alliances. The opening history of the setting can largely be told through the lens of the first one we'll talk about, so let's jump right into it, shall we? AKA the good guys, and this time I can say that with slightly more confidence than one usually can when you mention someone being the good guy in Warhammer. Grand Alliance Order can almost entirely be said to come about as a result of Sigmar himself, the big god from fantasy who's now been promoted to being the dude who gave the setting its name. After the end times, Sigmar floated through nothingness for God only knows how long on the core of the Warhammer fantasy world. Eventually a magical dragon called Dracothian found him, and using the winds of magic that used to exist in fantasy, the dragon created the 8 mortal realms as they're now known, one for each wind of magic. Sigmar started wandering around this new reality, beating things over the head and trying to restart civilization. As he did so, he found a bunch of other goobers who survived Warhammer Fantasy's destruction and convinced him to join him in his quest. Some of them, like the dwarf gods, didn't need too much convincing to rebuild civilization. They were down from the start. Others, like the god of the greenskins, Gorka Morka, had to be convinced via hammer wax to the skull for a week straight. But he was successful, and eventually he managed to form a pantheon of gods from the survivors of his old home. Things were good for a while. Order prospered, and while there were the occasional threats from goblin or Skaven invasions, overall it was great. Then the Pantheon started infighting, chaos invaded, and eventually everything fell apart and Sigmar had to give up and go back home to the realm he was the specific god of, Azyr. He worked on making super soldiers for a while, eventually threw open the gates of Azyr and started taking names once again, and after enough time, some of his old Pantheon decided to work together once more, albeit not nearly to the level they once did. Grand Alliance Order now stands against the various factions that would see civilization brought low, people that would either twist it into a parody of itself or completely erase it altogether. There have been ups and downs and they're fighting to reclaim reality in the name of all that's good, but they all stand ready to face whatever threats come their way. And as a quick summary, that's largely the history of Grand Alliance Order you need. While this is the good guy faction, it only truly applies to about 2/3 of the factions within it, if we're being generous. Some of them are pretty evil and led by evil gods, and others are happy to work for anyone to get what they want, including chaos. But while there is some nuance to it, they are still the best of a bad bunch by far. Even the most evil of them would still like to rule over a civilization. They all want to build up cities and empires and things that, while potentially evil, are better than endless undeath, endless destruction, or the endless machinations of the Chaos Gods. Order factions might stab you, but most of the time they'll also be willing to patch up your wounds, if only so you can serve them later on. As for the armies within it, let's look at the poster boys first, shall we? Also known as Sigmarines, Ground Marines, and about 1,000 other variations of that, all pointing out that this was GW putting Space Marines into a fantasy setting. And to get the dismissive part of me out of the way first, yeah, that's what they are. All other things aside, looking at their models you can clearly see what GW wanted out of them. Large and in-charge figures above the common man with lots of smooth, flat surfaces that a new painter can easily get to grips with. But that isn't all that they are. When Sigmar first was in the mortal realms, he stuck with normal old people as his armies. After all, while the previous world blew up, normal people were able to hold the line for about 2,000 years, and that's only including the time he specifically was either in charge or a god. That's a decent record, so we gave him another go. Unfortunately, while normal people did hold the line for a while again, they once again weren't able to stop chaos from invading and causing problems across everywhere. So he went back home to Azir, and with some help from the dwarf god Grungni, got to work. Across the mortal realms, he looked for those who were above and beyond what you could expect of anyone. Notably, he didn't do this by looking for level 20 D&D adventurers, though. This wasn't the Space Marine Trials where the strongest or otherwise bestest guy gets to be jammed full of gene seed. Sigmar looked for men, women, and potentially even non-humans from any standing who were being heroes. If you were a doctor who spent 23 out of 24 hours a day patching up soldiers to help fight chaos and then died fighting chaos warriors with a chandelier, Sigmar would grab your soul at either the moment of your death or right before and spirit you to Azir. He wasn't looking for soldiers, because you can train anyone well enough to know how to fight. He was looking for people whose spirits, not bodies, put them above the rest. He'd give you a bit of his own godly essence, equip you with the finest of armor forged from the core of a dead world, and prepare you for a fight against the people that already caused at least one apocalypse. He did this for a few centuries before he couldn't wait any longer, and then he sent forth the Stormcast Eternals. In massive bolts of lightning, entire armies of Stormcast drop down onto the mortal realms, because if you're gonna be fighting literal demons, you might as well look like a power metal album cover at all times. Across 8 realities, Sigmar's forces waged war, supercharged men and women tearing into chaos wherever they went and reclaiming reality for the good people who either once did or still live there. After reclaiming Sigmar's very own hammer Galmaraz, it was gifted to the Celestin Prime, aka Stormcast Primarch, aka Karl Franz Reborn, and his fighting forces were at the top of their game and reclaiming more and more land every day. Eventually their blitz came to a halt, but they had laid the groundwork for order to once again flourish in at least select areas of the mortal realms. Stormcast Eternals are very much like Space Marines at their core, but according to former GW author Josh Reynolds, saying they're identical is like saying that because Batman and Captain America are both superheroes, they're the same thing entirely. Stormcast Eternals are closer to demigod knights. They're undoubtedly stronger and overall greater than the average person, at least in terms of what they can do, but that doesn't mean they necessarily lord it over the average man. Like Spider-Man says after watching Uncle Ben get murked for the 1000th time, with great power comes great responsibility, and the Stormcast are determined to use their gifts to enact Sigmar's will. When they aren't fighting, they're oftentimes local rulers, administrators, hell, there might even be a few Stormcast taxmen out there. I'd imagine they'd be quite good at convincing people to pay up. They're above the common man, but unlike Space Marines, they aren't separate from them. And Sigmar, by all accounts, does seem to want to do the best he can for the mortal realms. He doesn't always succeed, and by the nature of Warhammer, sometimes he oversteps his bounds or does a bit of a morally great goof. But he tries his best to save everyone, and the Stormcast are a reflection of that. They come in swinging to save the day against all the odds, and oftentimes they manage to do just that. Stormcast are also something that I think has been long overdue in all of Warhammer. A good guy faction that can properly respawn. When a Stormcast dies, their soul is spirited back to Azir to be reforged and sent back out there. The process isn't perfect, as 4th edition has made ever more clear. As you get reforged more and more, you eventually lose your personality and become little more than a raging ball of magical Azir energy that barely remembers what they're even fighting for. But though the process does eventually become horrific, the Stormcast are a way for the good guys to stay in the fighting almost as permanently as the forces of chaos, who themselves have never really been reliably killable since their inception. Plus, the first death ain't so bad. You might get some short-term memory loss and a raging grudge against whoever killed you, but I'd say that's worth it to be able to hunt down whatever killed you and turn their skull into a drinking cup. Again, much like the Marines, you can find various different chapters, or storm hosts rather, to paint your army as and enjoy their distinct flavor of Sigmarine. The Hammers of Sigmar are the poster boys, the ones with all the attention on the boxes that wear blue and gold and are the standard for the army. Even when they aren't here, the Ultramarines truly are the greatest of them all. The Anvils of the Heldenhammer, meanwhile, are a gloomy bunch of folk who were forged from long-dead heroes rather than recently dead or about to die ones. They even worship another god than Sigmar, Morda, who's heavily implied to be more from Warhammer Fantasy reincarnated. Much like the Marines, you can find any theme to paint, and if you don't like the ones on display by GW, you have free reign to make your own. The setting is quite homebrew friendly for those of you who want a chance to get a bit creative. While they aren't perfect, the Knights Excelsior's habit of massacring everyone who isn't 110% Team Sigmar shows this. The Stormcast by and large are what GW seems to want modern-day Space Marines to be. Heroes with bits of moral ambiguity about them and plenty of trauma, but ones that are ultimately fundamentally heroic in nature. They stand tall against the darkness, be that chaos or even their supposed allies, all in the name of keeping the lights on just a little bit longer. If you want heroes that finally have the same staying power as all the other bad guys without resorting to plot armor to explain how Marnia's Calgar is somehow still alive, the Stormcast are perfect for you. The Stormcast standing tall above the average man wouldn't mean much without being able to see the average man to compare them to though, which brings us to... Here's where you can make your home, fans of the Imperial Guard or the Empire of Man. The Cities of Sigmar is the collective name for all the various cities of mortals that have cropped up across the mortal realms in the wake of the Stormcast lightning strikes across the realities. Nominally aligned, and they at least usually don't go to war with each other, they're in reality entirely different cultures and political entities that mostly do their own thing. Plenty of interactions between the cities occurs, but in a given moment there's no one standardized government they all pay fealty to. Aside from whichever god may happen to be visiting one on a given day, of course, since in Age of Sigmar that can just happen. The cities tend to be centered around realm gates, the method by which travel can be done between realms. Not only does this make them major hubs of trade, it allows for order to more easily go to and from warzone to warzone. In worst case scenarios, it also gives an easy point of retreat into if Khorne starts bulldozing through your house. The cities of Sigmar to me can be separated into two distinct time periods, both in-universe and out. In-universe, they used to act in much the same way the Imperial Army did for the Space Marines during the Great Crusade. The forces of the cities were the auxiliaries to the superhuman Stormcast, and they would follow along and garrison reconquered areas, helping respread civilization to lands retaken from chaos. In real life during this time, they were both a collection of every race and a collection of old Warhammer Fantasy models jammed into one army. Empire, High Elves, Dark Elves, Dwarves, all of them working together in unison to push back the darkness and carve themselves a home in this new world. As time went on in universe, the cities of Sigmar began heading more of their own actions, and the Stormcast oftentimes became force multipliers in their crusades, much like the Guard and Space Marines relationship often is in modern 40k. The Dawnbringer Crusade and the actions undertaken by it were spearheaded by the cities themselves, and the Stormcast, now that their literal lightning strikes have been significantly slowed down, fight alongside these mortals as often as not. And in real life, the cities of Sigmar have over time gotten plenty of unique models all to themselves that weren't just old fantasy models GW still wanted to profit off of because they had too many spares lying around. Describing all the cities in broad strokes beyond that is something I do have a bit of trouble doing, because as I said, they're all distinct entities beyond the models. Greywater Fastness is a city in the realm of life that paradoxically is a highly industrialized arms center, which naturally causes tensions between them, Sigmar, and the people in the nature realm that don't much like pollution and gunpowder smoke. Anvilgard is, or rather was in some ways, a gloomy city shrouded in smoke and darkness on account of the massive amount of pesticides covering the landscape, and no, I didn't make that up. It doesn't actually hurt anything beyond the plants they're designed to hold back, but the intense gloom this causes means that this city, among other reasons, has become a medieval/fantasy version of Night City. Now, in Age of Sigmar, you probably won't be chroming up as much as David, but a choom can still find themselves some eddies if they're willing to do some dirty work. There's a city for any theme you can think of, since AOS, as I said, is quite friendly to those who want to create a unique army. The mortal realms are said to be nearly limitless as well, so again, just make up your own city if you don't like what's available. That applies to basically every army, so I'll stop saying it going forward. The cities of Sigmar lore-wise are the normal dudes who hold the line against terrors beyond their comprehension, because normal folk in Warhammer can stand against demons quite alright. Model-wise, however, I have to confess I'm not the biggest fan. Not because they're bad models, these guys are great, but the new models the army has are a bit too detailed for what's supposed to be the average Joes and Janes of the setting. There's a lot going on here, and to me it's a bit too much for what's supposed to be just average people. But at the same time, part of Warhammer's fun is how balls to the wall it is, and the cities of Sigmar certainly don't have bad-looking models. So if you want to hold the line with a wall of guns and artillery backed up by people with shields and hammers that really aren't suited to what they're fighting, the cities of Sigmar provide here as the Guard and Empire do elsewhere. Also, almost the entire Dark Elf range from Warhammer Fantasy is still here, so if you hate Age of Sigmar and can stomach being a Legends army in Old World, you still have reason to visit the Age of Sigmar web store. Elves. I love them. The fantasy side of Warhammer seems to love them too. The 40k side seems to absolutely hate elves. But Age of Sigmar falls under that first category, so before anything else, my first recommendation is that if you're an Eldar fan but wish the authors didn't hold you in contempt, then come on over here. The Lumineth and the elves in Age of Sigmar have a neat history. Initially, the surviving elves who became gods, Tyrion, Teclis, Malekith, and Arathi, started helping out civilization as Sigmar was. They noticed there weren't nearly as many elves as there were human or dwarfs in the mortal realms, however. So with Marathi's guidance, they follow a trail leading them to none other than Slaanesh herself, who still has most of the elf souls inside of her. Because Slaanesh had a full tummy from digesting too many elves at once, she was basically just sitting in a cave waiting for either all those souls to be processed or history's worst case of the hangover shits ever seen. Also, if you take a look at this official piece of Warhammer artwork, you will notice that Slaanesh is uncircumcised. I hope you enjoy this cursed knowledge as much as I do, which is not at all. After divvying up the elf souls, Tyrion and Teclis got to work with their share and eventually created the Lumineth Realm-Lords based on the High Elves of old, including, in at least one case, the soul of a former High Elf who's now Alphonse from Fullmetal Alchemist. Things were great for a while until Chaos showed up, in this case due to the Lumineth kind of reacting the fall of the Eldar. There was less hedonism and more magical WMDs in this case though, and they named it the Spirefall. It looked like the end until Teclis spoke to the Spirit of the Moon and came back to reorganize their entire society based on its wisdom. Now the Lumineth are a staunchly disciplined society seeking to spread their endless wisdom across the mortal realms, and at least half the time they actually ask others if they'd like to receive the wisdom first. The other half the time, you will be receiving their wisdom, and if you disagree, these nice elves over here will take you into this unmarked building to politely explain why you really should just listen to them. The Lumineth are the High Elves of the setting, although certainly different at least in aesthetics to the old ones. Whereas the High Elves in fantasy were ancient Greek, the Lumineth are very ancient Greek. I know a hoplite when I see one, and these are clearly hoplites even if the shield isn't as round as it should be. Of course, they also have strange elemental spirits that are equal parts familiar and spiritual companion to accompany them and guide them on whatever journey they may undertake. And going beyond even that, Big Cow is here to smash you into the ground with. The Lumineth are strange beings that many think are made of pure light at first, and their geometric magics and relationships with their realm's native spirits has given them a spice setting them apart from standard High Elves. They're still viciously arrogant, and sometimes they aren't so much as freeing people as putting them under new management, but the management is nicer than Chaos and their arrogance is mostly earned. When they were introduced, they did curb stomp the entirety of Grand Alliance death. I'd have a bit of an ego too. They got some of the most active gods in the setting backing them up too. Teclis, my beloved little twink, is still around as a proper god now, and since he's a playable tabletop model, you can assume he gets around quite often even without reading his lore in AOS. He's still suffering because the life of Teclis is inherently suffering, but now he's a god while doing it. Although his followers will oftentimes politely request to speak to his moon spirit friend because they'd rather hear the wisdom from the source than through Teclis. The poor guy's a god and he still doesn't get the respect he deserves, he just can't catch a break. Tyrion, meanwhile, is a blind god that sees through Teclis' eyes now and has been supposedly fighting against Malekith as he did in Old Fantasy, although as of writing this, we've received basically nothing else on him. The Lumineth formed their societies and kingdoms into Tyrionic and Teclian nations based on which of the brothers they more emulate, though of course all cities revere both of them. The Lumineth fight hard and study aplenty with the same arrogance elves always bring to the table, but they've again largely earned it on account of averting their own total destruction and being so good at countering chaos and death. If you want elves, you can do no better than them, because their models are all new, they're bringing back some heavy hitter characters from fantasy, and even 2,000 years onward, everyone still loves a good phalanx. Fun fact, they all do crack. There's a substance called Aether Quartz that heightens their senses vastly. When it wears off, it drains them of emotions, leaving them a bit dull to the world. Since these elves come from the land of logic and reason, some of them view this as a positive outcome since it strips away those troublesome emotions and whatnot. Others just still use it like crack though. So not only is it possible for you to get jumped by an army of crackheads in Age of Sigmar, it's downright common depending on who you're fighting. I did tell a slight fib earlier. Morathi early on wasn't a god unlike her son and step-great-grandsons. She naturally wasn't happy with this, so when everyone was dividing up the portion of elf souls they got, Morathi messed with the process to get a few more than she deserved. This weekend the binding's holding Slaanesh, but Morathi is a prick, so this didn't mean much to her. Although in saying that, she has a few times mentioned worrying about Slaanesh escaping, which makes me wonder if she's gone insane in some part, or is just fundamentally incapable of recognizing anything she does is actually a bad thing. Probably both. Morathi also found something from the old world to help her become a goddess, the Heart of Khaine, the elven god of war. She set up a religion around it based in many ways upon the Dark Elves' old Witch Elves, and with enough worship and sacrifices given to the heart, it said that Khaine would be reborn. This is entirely true, but she was the whole time siphoning the worship and sacrifices to Khaine to herself. Slowly she gained more power, and eventually with a dramatic ritual and journey into Slaanesh, she achieved apotheosis and ascended to true godhood. This has caused a bit of a schism in their society between those who happily worship Morathi as Khaine reborn, and those who are upset they got scammed by a lady with a history of being far closer to her son than a mother ever should be, but she doesn't care for the opinions of those below her. The Daughters of Khaine are the most outright evil of the Order factions. Even ignoring Morathi and her antics, they are fervent worshippers of the elf god of murder. That's their baseline, they're not gonna be nice. The best case scenario is that they focus all that murder worship against the forces of chaos, destruction, or death, but that's of course not always the case. Morathi sniped the city of Anvilgard out from under Sigmar's nose when she ascended. The DOK are more than happy to fight their supposed allies. They have few, if any, true friends, and are largely tolerated instead of appreciated. In day-to-day life, they're, again, very murdery. The Daughters of Khaine aren't named as such just because it sounds cool. They're a highly matriarchal society, to the point that Morathi had a spell cast that siphons a bit of the soul out of every male elf into her magical cauldron. They do have some more beyond being the land of femdom enjoyers, however. Chiefly, they're snake ladies. Those snake ladies came about from the fact that some elves were a bit too corrupted by their time in Slaanesh's gut, and so they've turned into gorgons. These beings are kept under a heavy magical glamour to make any non-Khainite allies see them as normal elves, albeit probably much taller than normal ones. Until her ascension, Morathi had to spend her time pretending that Khaine was who they really were worshipping rather than her by technicality, and she would have a habit of sending those who got too close to the truth out on suicide missions. By contrast, her ascension means that she can be open about it, but now religious strife is much more common. The Daughters of Khaine do in fact worship a god, and because her magic was partially centered on Khaine's heart, she can be argued to be Khaine reborn, but they do not worship Khaine Khaine as he was and as they thought they did. The fact I focus so much on Morathi in these armies section isn't only because I'm a hack who would bend over backwards for Morathi in every way you can mean with that saying. It's because she's turned herself into the cult of personality and driving force behind this faction. Without her, I don't think it's a mistake to say there would be no Daughters of Khaine. In short, if you like the idea of hot naked elf ladies, with some hot naked men as auxiliaries, butchering their enemies, or if you're down for a society layered in religious intrigue and strife, the Daughters of Khaine are perfect for you. Or if you're a prick who thinks everyone else exists to serve you, they're also the perfect army for that kind of person. Morathi is still the worst, and even without her, these elves think stabbing someone on the throat in the street is a great way to give praise to their god. Another lie from earlier, this time one by omission, was that the Lumineth were not the first attempt at recreating the High Elves. There were a few different tries, and Teclis on one of his earlier attempts created some elves that were off. They were resentful, withdrawn, and traumatized. Obviously this was from their time stuck in Slaanesh, but Teclis wanted to find out the specifics and if there was any underlying corruption. Problem is, when he took away Idoneth to figure it out, it tended to leave them outright insane. Understandably fearing for their lives and sanity, these elves who would become the Idoneth Deepkin took a magical lantern from Teclis and fled into the perfect place to remain completely hidden, the very seas themselves. Teclis initially wanted to exterminate them, both for their inherent wrongness and probably because he was upset they stole his stuff, but Tyrion managed to talk him out of it. This meant nothing for the Idoneth, however. Calling out to the god of Mithlan, as many of these elves were actually sheltered by him in old fantasy before the world's destruction, they received only silence because he was dead. The other gods they reached out to were either also dead, couldn't hear them, or for one reason or another ignored them, and so they tried to recreate Mithlan and form society without divine guidance all on their own. Eventually, they recognized that though Teclis was a bastard to them, he likely had a point about them being potentially corrupted. So they looked over themselves and found not one, but two curses plaguing them. The first is an occasional turbo madness that makes them fly into a frenzy, killing everything around them. This is actually quite rare, thankfully, though for obvious reasons is problematic when it happens. The second problem is one that spells disaster for them existing for longer than a single generation. Only 1 in 100 Idoneth, or 1 in 10 depending on when the lore you read is from, actually survive past infancy. The reason for this is that their souls wither away almost immediately, as if their souls were aging a rate 1,000 times faster than their bodies were. They tried to solve it and indeed still do, but in the meantime eventually discovered a horrific way to stave off the problem, stealing the souls of others to keep theirs healthy. They did try this on animals at first, but that only gave them a few days. Sapient beings, however, gave them decades of soul and allowed them to actually live lives, and so the Idoneth took to raiding coastlines to stave off extinction. Eventually this turned into them doing it whenever they needed to expand, and while they try to focus on the bad eggs of the mortal realms to soul suck, many of them view the other races as nothing more than food for their expansion. For a while they were a secret faction, with only a few people having a faint idea that they existed. Sigmar knew there was something dangerous underwater, but didn't have the time to look for it, and NAGASH as well knew that someone was stealing the souls that were rightfully his to steal. Helping this is that the Idoneth have their own sort of magical glamour they can use that at least partially erases the memories of whoever they raid, hiding their actions for centuries. That, and they rarely left anyone behind after a raid, with the few survivors that did exist either considered too traumatized to give reliable information, or madmen to disregard entirely. Eventually, during one raid, Alarielle found out, since by virtue of being a goddess, she's immune to their memory shenanigans, and from there on out, everyone else slowly but surely learned of their existence. When chaos came, they tentatively allied with the rest of Order, but similar to the Daughters of Khaine, no one truly trusts them, even if they only raid because they have to. The Idoneth have adapted to living underwater entirely, and are masters of remaining hidden, at least on the large scale. Telling your average cities of Sigmar grunt to go invade underwater isn't going to work for them any better than it did Caligula. Their society has 3 tiers in it. The Namarti are those vast majority of Idoneth with leaky souls that need topping off. They make up the various battle line foot soldiers of the Idoneth and are born eyeless, with the book briefly retconning them into having their eyes ritualistically cut out of them before it was itself retconned, and now they're born eyeless again. The Achelians are those that are essentially normal elves, albeit ones that live underwater. They're the warrior caste and general leaders of society, dictating policy and ruling over the Namarti. And then there's the Isharan, the priests and mages of Idoneth society. Idoneth still being elves, naturally the wizards get their own caste. Technically there is a 4th caste, the Sithai, that consists of the original Idoneth made by Teclis, but there's only one of them left, so it doesn't really count. The Idoneth are certainly closer to the bad guy end of things than not, but this time it isn't their fault. They aren't the Dark Eldar for the most part, as all but the most brutal and bloodthirsty of their enclaves either regret having to take the lives of others, or at the very least aren't happy with having to do so. Their souls just wither away if they don't, however, and while it's easy to just say, live with it, I imagine it's another thing entirely when it's your soul that's draining away like a leaky faucet. The Dark Eldar could prevent their soul drain through alternative methods, they just like being assholes on top of everything. The Idoneth can't. Even the bloodthirsty ones seek a cure to their affliction, because at the end of the day, not having your soul drain out at all is ideal. Beyond that nuance, though, they're one of the most unique armies GW has ever produced. Even die-hard fantasy old heads usually grudgingly admit that the Idoneth Deepkin models are spectacular, because the ocean as a theme is something criminally underrepresented, especially in tabletop gaming. When they go to war, a magical occurrence called the Eversea follows them, which means that their eel and shark mounts can fly through the air as if they were underwater. Coral reefs, shipwrecks, and more randomly appear around them, and even though you can still breathe, whenever you exhale, bubbles come out as if you were underwater. That's really cool, if you'll pardon that advanced technical language. If you're interested in what's arguably the best depiction Warhammer's ever had of the ends actually justifying the means, or you're just Jotaro Kujo and love marine biology, this army is for you. I mean, come on now. Big turtle. The only problem with this model is that there isn't a big octopus or something to go along with him. Praise be to Big Turtle. Alarielle the Everqueen, one of the 2 leaders of the High Elves, Avatar of Isha, and eventually Life Magic itself, and an all-around My Little Pony character put through the filter of Warhammer. She woke up all alone in the Age of Sigmar, having been put through the ringer to say the least. Her boyfriend was gone and for all she knew dead, and all she had for company were soul pods from the old world. So she started planting those soul pods. While she was a lot more PTSD-ridden than before, she was still a nature elf queen who was now a full-blown goddess, so she sang to them all a song that resounded in their very souls. Reborn as nature spirits, the Sylvaneth flourished in the peaceful realm of life. Then Chaos showed up and shit, everything's on fire and disease-ridden. To make it worse, Alarielle's normal elf worshippers all dipped out on her, leaving her and the tree spirits on their own. They put up a decent fight, but almost all of Nurgle's forces were devoted to her, eventually culminating in Alarielle's death. As bad as that sounds, she's the goddess of nature, life and rebirth and all that crap included, so the Stormcast Eternals replanted her own soul pod in the ground and she came out almost as lively as she was in fantasy, albeit significantly angrier. She started kicking ass and taking names, pushing back Nurgle as best she could and eventually becoming a major player in the mortal realms once more. She's mostly forgiven those elves who abandoned her in the Age of Chaos, though her tree children are far more mixed on that matter, and she's begun talking to and working alongside the other gods and factions. The Sylvaneth revere her as their mother goddess, and while she is similarly a massive fixture of their culture as Morathi is to the daughters of Khaine, here it's much less evil. She's genuinely a guiding mother goddess who sure dictates policy, but they're all happy to let her do it, and she absolutely does have the Sylvaneth's best interest in her heart. She is the forest in most ways that matter, so even if she ever did something that appears utterly selfish, by helping herself, she still helps the Sylvaneth. The Sylvaneth are far from evil, but they are in many ways an alien society. It's a bit of the Ents from Lord of the Rings mixed with the fact that I at least feel it's perfectly understandable that a tree spirit would have different priorities and mindsets to a meatbag. They're far more in tune with natural energies, which is part of why that greywater fastness business with the cities of Sigmar pissed them off so much before Alarielle worked out a compromise. Some of them are assholes. Drycha is a pretty malevolent tree spirit from Warhammer Fantasy that Alarielle brought back as a wooden battle mech looking monster. Even at their worst, if you leave them alone, they'll probably leave you alone. Each of them is born to fulfill a role, and they carry with them not only that same song Alarielle sang in ages past, but the memories of their entire bloodline, tree line. Whatever Grandpa Tree did lives on in them, however you want to word it. Even the youngest of Sylvaneth is an ancient being because of this, with memories stretching back to their race's infancy. It's not all peaceful tree stuff, being a Warhammer game and all that. Drycha leads a group called the Outcasts, Sylvaneth that no one is quite sure how they popped up, but everyone knows they're insane, murderous beasts. They're semi-tolerated because they're good at killing intruders, but even in the semi-hive mind of the Sylvaneth, there is discord to be found. On a meta level, it is a bit of a shame that there aren't really any elves left around in what is clearly the sequel army to the Wood Elves, although they do make up for it somewhat by there being tree ghosts on top of normal tree people. If you wish Treebeard was led by an angry elf queen and some of his brothers might water the roots by soaking him in the blood of their enemies though, they're the perfect army for you still. I'd also recommend therapy in that case, but painting the Sylvaneth can tide you over till you get that scheduled out. What if we took the Slayers from Warhammer Fantasy, gave them an incredibly interesting culture, and also made them the only thing in the army and therefore ruined what made them unique? Welcome to the Fyreslayers, the most milquetoast army ever released by GW, at least in terms of appearance. As I said, cool lore though. When Sigmar found those two dwarf gods, Grimnir and Grugni, they both said they'd do him a solid since he freed them from being chained to a mountain. Grugni said to take his time, slow and steady wins the race, and that Big S could call in that favor whenever. Grimnir wanted to get his debt cleared immediately, so Sigmar shrugged and pointed at a giant lava monster that he told Grimnir to then kill. Grimnir succeeded, but also died in the process, blowing up and scattering across the mortal realms. Even this early on, a lot of dwarfs, it turned out, were still big fans of Grimnir, so they started looking for the pieces of him that coalesced into what's known as Urgold. And since Grimnir was a god of war that they worshipped, they naturally decided that forming their entire society into lodges and hiring themselves off as mercenaries in exchange for gold payment was as good a way to gather Grimnir bits as any. So they did just that. Thus do we get the Fyreslayers, brutal melee combatants searching all of reality to hopefully piece their god back together, one gold coin at a time. And even if they can't, they're still dwarfs. Urgold is special to them, but none of them are going to say no to regular gold either, so if it ends up being a waste of time, they still get to own their fighting skills and become filthy rich doing it. For a bit on their culture, Fyreslayers are big on having kids, meaning for perhaps the first time ever, dwarfs are not an endangered species. At least one runefather of a Fyreslayer lodge has 50 goddamn children, so across the mortal realms do these dwarf bees occasionally strike out to form a new lodge/hive and ply their trade in the dangerous lands of Age of Sigmar. With the finest of crafts dwarfship do these stunties equip themselves, selling themselves out to anyone, even chaos sometimes. The ends justify the means in their eyes, for their end goal is nothing less than the reconstruction of a god. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but if short, naked, hairy redheads is your thing, then you can do no better than this army. And the flavor of why they fight is admittedly some of the best ever. Like any mercenary group, who you're fighting for is secondary. The price is what makes it right. They're not my cup of tea, truth be told, but I imagine if you like the Fyreslayers, then you'll love the Fyreslayers. Fyreslayers. It's easy to be dismissive of the angry carrot tops until 100 of them burst through your wall because the payment fell short. Not all of the dwarfs were the Fyreslayers, though. Some of them were the standard dwarf, or if you want to suck off GW's legal department, Duardin. I'm calling them dwarfs. Anyways, some dwarfs were what you'd expect, living in mountains and mining and all that fun stuff. Then, when Chaos invaded, they retreated to their mountain homes to hopefully weather the storm, as dwarfs typically do. This almost universally did not work, and most of the survivors of these dwarfs were those that constructed massive flying fortress cities and took to the skies for survival. Powering this was another form of gold known as Aether Gold, a colorless gas that can only be detected by smell that also gives them super miner's lung in addition to standard crazed dwarf gold lust. Early on in the Kharadron's history, they were constantly beset by Chaos invaders. Between this and the fact that Aether Gold tends to attract monsters, Kharadron civilization tends to be equal parts military fleet and actual city. With the Idoneth Deepkin, you can make Bioshock jokes because they all live in underwater cities. With the Kharadron Overlords, you can make Bioshock jokes because this is a hyper-capitalist group of self-reliant entrepreneurs who in some ways are even more mercenary than the Fyreslayers. Also the floating cities, although you are limited to Bioshock Infinite jokes in that case. They took a long look at dwarf society, which prior to this in AOS was not far removed from fantasy's old dwarfs, and reevaluated everything to see what should stay and what should go. The intense focus on craftsmanship and quality stayed, of course. These are still dwarfs, but science and technology was even more pursued, innovations ruthlessly invested in, and religion largely abandoned. Grugni seemingly abandoned them to their fates when Chaos invaded, and even though this was because he was afraid he'd smother their progress and he thought they could handle things on their own, the Kharadron naturally didn't take this too well. Technical atheism is the religion of the Kharadron, as gods are fickle beings that can abandon you on a whim. And while the Fyreslayers love profit because any gold can potentially be gold, the Kharadron take it to another level. Grudges are by and large only pursued if doing so won't cause loss in profit. Everything is weighed in terms of gains and losses. If you will lose money doing something, or at the very least it won't in the long term see a return on your investment, an action is not going to be taken. Abandoning your allies, ironically enough, is something the Kharadron situationally approve of. If they can be saved, then effort should be made to do so, but if the cause is completely hopeless, then sorry fellas, the Kharadron aren't swooping in to save the day. Even then, a lot of the time they'll only save you because a living ally is profitable. No sense letting all your trading partners die, after all. Their ruling government body, the Geldrad, is far closer to a board of directors than it is a government entity. If a dwarf can make a profit, they can rise high in Kharadron society, but if they can't, then good luck getting anywhere. All of these things are very Ayn Randy and self-serving, but the roots of their society are a brutal battle for survival. In their nascency, there was no room for an incompetent leader to take hold and give shitty commands just because they were the kid of the last one. The Kharadron needed both a decisive action and to ensure that tradition didn't stifle them. So, the ultimate meritocracy was born. If you do well, you get to be rich, because doing well, especially in the early days, meant you prevented total destruction by the hordes of chaos. There is no nobility in the Kharadron Overlords, at least not in terms of titles and land passed down through generations. There's only the ruthless free market, all sorts of fun steampunk tropes, and dwarfs whose dreams burned like a rocket inside. The Kharadron have had a rather hard time, all things considered. As the setting went on, their skyports faced disaster after disaster, with some of them being completely destroyed and just about all of them facing repeated crises between Nagash, Chaos, and the occasional band of goblins who got far luckier than they have any right to. But despite this, they persevere. They're the most technologically advanced race by far, and while not being able to use magic sucks, giant flying gun zeppelins make up for it plenty well enough. Plus, just look at this guy. Is this not the most glorious thing ever? Steampunk dwarfs so committed to the bit that they have armored top hats and 19th century robber baron mustaches. Absolutely phenomenal. They also live by a set of highly detailed rules dictating what's good and not, based on profit of course. And, since they pilot floating armadas, and if you kill everyone who'd snitch, you can go home scot-free, them being pirates is very much an option for your own army. So if you live to make as much money as feasibly possible, love cheesing the economy and strategy games, and think that any code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules, the Kharadron Overlords are perfect for you. Fantastical heroes are all well and good, but there's something uniquely captivating about paving over a magical forest in the name of the Industrial Revolution. the last army in Grand Alliance order. In some ways, the Seraphon, or Lizardmen as I will call them, have stayed the same since Vanity, but in others, they've evolved. After the end times, the Lizardmen that remained floated across space in their massive temple pyramid spaceships until one by one, only a few of them were left. But during this journey, they too met Dracothian, who directed them to Azir, same as Sigmar. Living above it in their ships, they resumed the sacred task they once held in Fantasy, countering the forces of chaos no matter where they appear. The biggest difference of their lore comes in the form of what exactly they are nowadays. Initially, there were like 5 of the Slaanesh mage priests that survived into the setting. The rest of the Lizardmen were sort of lightning demons remembered into existence by the Slaanesh. Whenever they weren't on the battlefield, they didn't really exist. Then more lore came out, and apparently there were other Lizardmen on those temple ships, and then eventually an entire separate arm of the Seraphon were revealed to live in the mortal realms as the Lizardmen of old did, coming out of spawning pools and now outright terraforming the land to resemble the jungles of Lustria. This all means that some others may have survived as well, or maybe they were initially magicked back into being by the Slaanesh before evolving. But either way, they aren't just the simple servants of the old ones any longer. Lightning and Azir energy flows through their very veins, and they counteract chaos far more effectively because of it. Other than that, though, they are still the same overall. In fact, the Lizardmen are perhaps the best survivors of Fantasy other than the Skaven, with just about all their models making it into AOS unscathed. Most of their new releases have been updates to the aging kits, because while the quality of the models could be improved, the concept of Aztec lizards riding dinosaurs is something that GW perfected already. Why fix what isn't broken? The majority of other changes they've received aren't actually changes, they've just been scaled up to fit into Age of Sigmar. They don't just fight demons, they're inherently anathema to demons and can now see farther into the future than even Tzeentch, the god of magic and fate. They don't just follow the great plan of a mystical race called the Old Ones, they've discovered that the previous setting blowing up may damn well have been part of the great plan, and Age of Sigmar is where the real fight begins. They don't just hate the Skaven, the sight of a Lizardman will send a Skaven into ancestral nightmare flashbacks of Skaven being sacrificed in Lustria. They do have personalities now though, or at least more of a personality. Lord Croak turned the stars above him into a grinning Pepe face, because when you have more power than most gods at your fingertips, you can be a shitlord all you want. No one can stop you. If you like Aztec lizards riding dinosaurs but want them on circles instead of squares, the Seraphon are for you. And with that, 1 Grand Alliance down, 3 to go. Christ. The following Grand Alliances are all vastly smaller though, so they won't take up quite as much time. Gorkamorka is the fusion of the 2 old orc gods, Gork and Mork. After Sigmar beat him up, he was pretty content with being part of the Pantheon. In the early days of the setting, massive creatures called God Beast roamed the lands and frequently wreaked havoc on the burgeoning civilizations. Even without them, there were still plenty of lesser threats. Therefore, Gorkamorka had a very simple job: go smash those Gits. And he did so with gusto. Eventually though, the threats became smaller in number and strength. By sheer virtue of his own power, Gorkamorka had eliminated a great deal of the threats against him. Plus, as you might expect from a god formed from the fusion of 2 orc gods, Gorkamorka didn't like anyone telling him what to do. So as the Pantheon first started to crack apart, and with some whispers from Tzeentch encouraging him, Gorkamorka went rogue and declared a Waaagh across the mortal realms. Literally, as in he declared they would go across all of the mortal realms and only stop to do it again. Before this happened, it fell into infighting, and Gorkamorka split back into Gork and Mork, but the damage was done. The Greenskins and everyone else in Grand Alliance Destruction were all on their own. In spite of being called Destruction, the members of this alliance don't all necessarily want to destroy the world. In fact, some of them are quite happy to work with the forces of Order, or occasionally the other 2 Grand Alliances. It's just that they tend to be rampaging morons at the absolute best, and at their worst, yeah, they want to smash everything. They don't want to smash everything permanently, but things like city building, philosophy, and the like aren't for them. They aren't true evil for the most part, but that's in comparison to the literal forces of hell that are chaos. They're still bad folk in a lot of ways. They all worship Gorkamorka in one regard or another, with some viewing him as he is, the 2-headed orc god, some as an all-consuming gluttonous god, and some worship him as a giant foot that steps on things. Goblins in Warhammer, be they goblins or grots, are funny little guys. They're goofy, they're vicious, they like to gang up on people in groups of 20 and stab them to death. Funny things like that. In Age of Sigmar, they are still funny little guys, but now with the Gloomspite Gits, they've thrown in a dash of cosmic horror for some extra spice. These little bastards weren't quite around during the Age of Myth, AOS's earliest era, but instead came about during the Age of Chaos. Originally fairly standard goblins driven underground by the hordes of the ruinous powers, they formed alliances and clans and predictably clashed frequently with the Skaven and various other dwarfs, the other two major underground players. They worship a few different deities, most prominently the Bad Moon, which they revere, and in turn has led them to hate the sun, because they've been underground for so long that sunlight burns their skin. In some ways, they're kinda like the creatures from The Descent, only greener and shorter. Mention must also be made of Boingob, the father of Squigs who tried to eat the sun and died doing it. In this setting, mind you, the sun is technically one of 8 realities making up the mortal realms. Now some Gloomspite live in his skull. God bless you, Boingob, you're a true hero to us all. For a while, these goblins were basically a myth, only rarely coming up to the surface and usually in a manner that didn't leave anyone left to tell about it. Suddenly 10,000 goblins devour a village entirely, that kind of deal. When the bad moon is full in the sky, spiders swarm the lands, mushrooms grow on every surface, everything becomes dank and moist, and of course, people go mad. Partway into the setting's history, the bad moon began appearing more frequently, and what was once a rare occurrence became far more common as these goblins began swarming the entirety of the mortal realms. Led by the Loon King, a goblin who the bad moon spoke to, they prepare for the Everdank, when the bad moon will be in the sky forever and goblinkind will rise up and control the world. Although lead is a strong word for this collective group of insane little buggers. They've got a few allies and pets in the form of creatures like trolls, squigs, and spiders, so while no other sapient likes them much, that suits them just fine. The bad moon's bugs and various other critters are all the friends they need. They do a whole lot of mushrooms, worship the insanity moon, and some of them live inside the skull of a giant divine mushroom monster that tried to eat the sun. A fun group of beings are they. If you like funny little guys that are murderous to most everything around them, they're a solid choice. Just look at these guys, don't they look like they're full of mirth? I will only ever refer to them as Orruks for the sake of titles and transitions. Being big, mean, and green is a classic staple of orcs, and these ones are no exception. Black orcs from Warhammer Fantasy were the largest orcs around, bigger than their fellows and capable of acts of strength few if any could rival at large. Those are the basic foot soldiers of some of the war clans, because they are some proper huge gits that don't shy away from a good scrap. When Chaos invaded, everyone else naturally hated it. These guys were absolutely loving it, however. Though Gorkamorka's reality-wide war had ended, Chaos provided them with a perfect alternative. Archaon initially tried to purge all of the Realm of Beasts of orcs. After an unspecific amount of both time and lost soldiers, he just gave up on bothering. The orcs just kept getting bigger and bigger as the fighting went on, and by the time Archaon called off the fighting, the big mean lads had grown to massive size, perfect for fighting. From there, they continued on as orcs in Warhammer do, getting into bigger and better fights at every opportunity they could find. And if they can't find an opportunity, they'll make one. Gordrak, the closest thing to a factional leader in the Alliance, has decided that he wants to go and punch Sigmar in the face. Now, this isn't a universal truth for gods in the setting, but for Sigmar and many others, they aren't just gods. They're at least partially their realm and type of magic incarnate, which means in some ways, this one orc wants to go up to the embodiment of the heavens and punch him in the balls. You have to give them props for ambition, if nothing else. There used to be the Savage Orcs as part of their roster called the Bone Splitters, but no longer. Those were removed, and there's been no news as to them going into Old World as of time of writing. Glad to see GW is always happy to axe things that people like and purchase at the drop of a hat. There is an alternative, however, the Cruel Boys subfaction of the Warclans. They're far closer to the original Lord of the Rings orc template, fairly sneaky and cowardly gits who are far crueler than battle-hungry moronic maniacs that the Ironjaws are. They're not the most Warhammer-y of orc factions, but they're unique for the setting and give the army a ton of variety. Even Gordrak of the Ironjaws had a surprisingly philosophical moment once. He said that he loves fighting, but no one else understands why that's good, or that others who love fighting love it wrong. Khorne wants to overrun everyone, and that's wrong, because then what's left to fight? But the forces of order building all those fancy cities is pointless. Why bother if you aren't going to struggle and fight for it? This is orc philosophy, as you can probably tell, so it's not exactly Socrates here, but it's also nice to see something beyond orc-like fight cause orc-like fight. That attitude is still present, of course, so if you think orc philosophers are completely stupid, it isn't hard at all to ignore them. The rampaging green goobers are still here and in great form, so if you want to show everyone who was made for fighting and winning and that green is bestest, then you'll still be plenty happy with these lads. Ogres in Warhammer are fun, brutal monsters that nonetheless can still work alongside others perfectly well, as long as they're paid in money and or food. If you don't pay them with either, then they'll rob you and eat you. One way or another, they'll get their payment, and the Ogor Mawtribes haven't changed too much from that formula. Some slight changes occurred, of course. If you're going to make a new setting, you might as well make some tweaks. Ogres now travel the mortal realms on the scryings of their butchers and the signs they read in guts of stuff they've, well, butchered. They travel the land and then eat whatever's there, much like the ogres of old. They'll still work with others, though, or at least demand food payment rather than eating someone on the spot, because that person can farm and give them fancy foods the ogres don't know how to cook. These wargluts, as they're called, wander the mortal realms, either eating everyone or making mercenary deals with everyone based on their tribe's attitude, and of course how hungry they are at a given moment. Even the nicest of ogres will still chow down on you if he hasn't eaten in a while, i.e. longer than 30 minutes. Of course, they aren't quite as nomadic as they were in fantasy. Most of them do now have some fairly primitive settlements to live in. They aren't dwarf holds or cities of Sigmar level, not by any means. They're still Stone Age. But compared to the tents they lived in fantasy, they've got some proper cities going, if for no other reason than even an ogre would like somewhere to come back home and enjoy a nice cooked meal from his Noblar slaves. Their god of the Great Maw is gone, but they worship Gorkamorka in much the same way, and there's even been appearances of giant teethed holes in the ground, hugely similar to the original Great Maw. And that being said, there is a group of entirely nomadic ogres that are out and about, the Beastclaw Raiders. These ogres are on a permanent tour of the mortal realms no matter which group of them you look at. This is because of a massive winter storm called the Everwinter that follows them all around. If you've ever gone to bed one winter night only to wake up to 6 feet of snow, it's like that, but forever. The Everwinter doesn't freeze the ogres to death, but instead freezes them into solid blocks of ice. This means they can actually thaw out at a later date, although being frozen solid does tend to leave them vulnerable to the various threats of this setting. Incidentally, this means that it's almost a guarantee that at least one group of cities of Sigmar armed forces have been glad that the ogre's in there and that he's the sheriff. No one really knows where the storm came from, but theories abound from being cursed by Gorkamorka himself to the original Beastclaw Raiders accidentally freeing some ancient gods that were particularly nasty. One theory even says that they gained the curse by eating the original curse-causing source when it caused issues for Alariel, but were blessed by her to all be expert winter trackers to avoid the storm's worst bits. I'd honestly put my money on that one. Even trauma-riddled as she is, Alariel's always been a good person. Regardless of which group you go with, though, ogres are large and in charge even more so than a lot of the Ironjaws and Chaos Warriors. They eat big, live big, and are more than happy to sit on enemies as a form of combat. Surprisingly effective when you're 12 feet tall and 10 feet wide, though I imagine that sitting on a Chaos Warrior would hurt from all those spiky bits. If you like mercenary work or just being a fat bastard who eats everyone who's rude about the fact, there's no equal to these lads. There is a rather minimal amount of lore to these guys, but I can't imagine most people are here for the lore. No, I presume you want to go fee-fi-fo-fum and play as the Imperial Knights of Age of Sigmar, because throwing a massive dude at your enemies as your chief form of tactics is good fun all around. And so we have the Sons of Behemat. Not that they have zero lore, mind you. It's all disgusting, however, so heads up. Long ago, there was a grandpa supergiant named Imnog. According to legend, he made reality itself by punching space so hard it exploded into the land, sea, and sky. Then he started eating so much of it that he got empreg with Behemat and his two brothers, who brewed ale in his stomach so potent that Imnog threw up in his sleep. They all escaped, but his brothers argued over who got to drink the vomit booze, and so were eaten again. Then Sigmar killed Imnog because he's Sigmar and pretty badass like that. Then Behemat fathered children with something. Not entirely sure what, but maybe there's a sister giant I'm missing just to make things even grosser. And eventually he too was killed by the Stormcast Eternals as he was becoming corrupted by chaos. Ever since, the Sons of Behemat have wandered the realms being fairly stereotypical giants. They raid things smaller than them for food, which is pretty much everyone, sometimes work with other people, and a rare few of them are literate enough to officially work with other people instead of being pointed at a rival group and being told those little things over there have yum-yums. Some of them in recent years have been getting colossal, however, which started ever since Behemat was slain. There's decent odds one giant, or Gargant if you'd like to be copyright friendly to GW, will ascend to become the next Behemat. Not much is needed on their lore to know what they're about, and quite frankly, they're pretty simple on tabletop as well. Yeah, their models have abilities and whatnot, and one of them has one of my favorite ones ever, which is to just kick an objective marker across the board. But by and large, they're giants. You're bigger than everyone else, you're dumber than most, and your chief god, aside from your species' dad, is something you view as a giant stompy foot. You'll likely have to endure no small amount of foot fetish jokes with how prominent feet are in this army's lore, but A, they're like that because most things aren't taller than their ankles, and B, you can smash flat the army of most anyone who says these kinds of things. For perhaps the purest Unga Bunga experience, come join the Sons of Behemat. They have all the vomit beer you could ask for and more. 2 down, 2 more to go. This is the Grand Alliance I'll talk about the least for each faction because it's chaos. By nature of it being chaos, which shows up in all Warhammer settings, there's only so much to say on them that hasn't been said elsewhere. So instead, I'll talk about the biggest highlights each faction has for the most part. Although before that, there are 2 interesting things to take note of. Age of Sigmar is technically a post-apocalypse for the first point, and I don't just mean the end times. The Age of Chaos wasn't just called that because chaos showed up, it was because chaos overran almost all of the mortal realms. The only major exception was Azyr, which was kept free because Sigmar sealed it off completely and killed anyone potentially corrupted. Everyone else was suffering to some extent or other, every realm suffering massive amounts of corruption. Sigmar only struck out with the Stormcast when he did because he was afraid reality couldn't take the strain of all that chaos much longer and was going to collapse into End Times 2.0. And now with that being said, chaos is funnily enough portrayed as more beatable than ever before. Sigmar and NAGASH supposedly went around dealing with threats that even the Chaos Gods would hesitate to challenge early on in the setting's history, and for the first time ever on a regular scale, those corrupted by chaos can be redeemed. The Stormcast Tornus the Redeemed was once a Chaos Lord of Nurgle, but because he, and indeed many others afterwards, held even the slightest bit of regret or wished to not follow Chaos any longer, they could be saved and were. While we know it'll never happen, because then Chaos fans will be royally pissed if nothing else, for the first time and perhaps ever, the ruinous powers don't just have to contend with being stalemated forever. They're at real risk from beings and armies every bit as powerful as their own. Slaanesh is in jail, remember. They're no longer immune just because they're the Chaos Gods. With those bits out of the way, let's see the armies. The followers of the God of War, Blood and Skulls are of course here in the Age of Sigmar, arguably looking even more like Space Marines than the Stormcast Eternals do. As with all Khornate forces, they love to gather blood and skulls and to engage enemies in brutal melee combat, for such is the will of the Blood God. Khorne's crowning achievement comes from before the time focused on by the games, but it's no less insane for that. When chaos overwhelmed most of the mortal realms, the followers of the Dark Gods found themselves short on foes to fight. Naturally, Khorne decided the best way to fix this wasn't to look for any last holdouts or try and invade Azyr. Nope, him and his armies decided the best way to pass the time was to declare war on the rest of chaos all at once, and at the very worst, they were holding their ground. The Blood God may have seen Nurgle take the spotlight on the video game and model side of things lately, but it would seem in the lore it's still Khorne who's the king of chaos. It was a multi-dimensional war too. As his mortal followers fought the other mortal followers of the gods, so too did his demons fight those of his divine rivals. Man said square up to the other 4/5 of the forces of chaos and was tying at worst. What a guy. They were excited when the Stormcast showed up because they finally had a worthy opponent to have a legendary battle with, and ever since they've continued on smashing things up. Not much to say, but there is something to appreciate about their simplicity. Smelly, stinky, disease-ridden, bloated carcasses that are too cheerful and delusional to realize they should be dead. The existence of Nurgle champions does beg the question. Are you truly fat if you're actually just bloated from infectious gases? Either way, they're still Nurgle followers through and through, spreading disease, sickness, pestilence, and decay one bacterium at a time. Initially, they were focused entirely on the realm of life, with some forces also going to Shyish. Death and rebirth being a big shtick of Nurgle, they naturally gravitated towards life and death realms, and he did also need to replace the life goddess he keeps in a jar. Ever since he was pushed back from them, however, Nurgle decided he should instead focus on all the realms equally, in much the same way Alarielle realized she couldn't focus only on her own if she hoped to weather the storm. After all of reality is equally deserving of Nurgle's love, is it not? We do get a depiction of a Stormcast actually seeing Nurgle in Age of Sigmar, however. He's properly terrifying, being described as this figure that stretched across the horizon as he walked the steps of his garden, with stars, nebulae, and entire galaxies being swallowed up by his immense and disease-ridden form. Countless souls crying for salvation that would never come followed him everywhere, because despite what his followers say, Nurgle's love is not good. So that's a nice mental image for Nurgle's AOS highlight. Magic, just as planned, magic, blue, birds, wizard, magic, blue. Tzeentch sure is still Tzeentch. He was particularly focused on the realm of metal, Khamon, because alchemy reasons and other magical nonsense. He does in the lore have a lot of fairly neat things like flying crystal towers that challenge the Kharadron cities, and he was not only partially responsible for turning Gorka Morka against the Pantheon, but helped with Sigmar having Galmaraz taken from him through illusions. But other than that, he's still Tzeentch. He's random, almost unknowable, unless you're a fat magic frog, is likely to help his enemies as his followers, and every time one of his followers loses, they pretend it was all part of the plan, because to be a Tzeentch worshipper is to be a frequent huffer of copium. The Zangars are at least slightly less obnoxious here than they are in 40k as well. Yeah, they're still everywhere, but as the outright fantasy setting, they fit far more appropriately here. I'm not signing up to join the divinely engineered super soldiers that have fallen to the forces of hell only to be told that half the army is blue goat birds. Easily these lads are the most changed of the Chaos faction. Because of Slaanesh being imprisoned by the elf gods, their followers have had to figure out what the hell to do, so they've largely split into 3 groups. One of them revolves around powerful Slaaneshi demons and champions that seek to become the next Slaanesh outright. Quite the ambitious goal, and one almost certain to fail, but you can't fault them for having hopes and dreams now, can ya? Another group wants to free Slaanesh so she can lead them once more. Rather more achievable, especially with Slaanesh getting closer to breaking free lately, but still a monumental challenge to overcome. The elf gods aren't exactly willing to let her be free once more, and so even though her prison has weakened, they still maintain a watchful eye over it, moving her occasionally as well to keep her more secure. And the third group just wants to do what all Slaanesh followers ultimately want to do. Have a good time and enjoy the ride. Turn a human being into a harp, distill the pure essence of suffering into wine, eat your sister because you wonder if she tastes any different than your brother that you already ate. AOS has done a wonderful job of expanding the specifics of degeneracy that Slaanesh followers exhibit. Behold Glutos or Scullion, fervent Hedonite of Slaanesh and the world's fattest non-ogre man. His name is close to glucose, and he is very, very fat. Whatever desire you can think of awaits you amongst the Hedonites, so if you don't want to miss the last train to Sodom and Gomorrah, hop right aboard and enjoy the ride to eternal damnation. It's fun while it lasts, and for Slaaneshi Chaos worshippers, that's all that matters. Good old-fashioned Chaos Warriors that, true, have been given a bit of a makeover, but still reign supreme as the ultimate heavy metal album cover. Adorned in spikes, skulls, spikes with skulls, and skulls with spikes, the followers of Chaos as a whole, rather than one dark god in particular, ride forth under Arkhan's orders to bring ruin to all that is good in the world. Pay close attention, literally every other Chaos army in every Warhammer setting, because this is how you be an evil badass. Arkhan supposedly spent his time in between Fantasy and Age of Sigmar destroying more universes. While anything said about Chaos should be taken with a grain of salt, I'm slightly more inclined to believe this line than I usually am about a given Chaos demon or character's power level. After all, he already blew up one world. Who's to say he couldn't do it again to a world far less prepared for and used to Chaos than Warhammer Fantasy was? He was supposedly also tested over and over again by the Dark Gods, always overcoming their trials and occasional outright murder attempts until we get to Age of Sigmar, where they're all at least a little bit afraid of the guy. Arkhan's essentially got unlimited permission to do whatever he wants, and while other Chaos champions can try to fight him, all it'll do is sign their death warrant. Other players do exist as well though, chiefly Be'lakor. He caused a Chaos Storm so potent once it prevented Stormcast Eternals from warping to Azir on death until countermeasures were eventually made. And to back up the classic heavily armored brick shithouse, Dark Oath Raiders are the descendants of normal people who fell to Chaos and Sigmar and the rest collective absence. Savage and brutal warriors all, the slaves to darkness are here to bring ruin to yet another Warhammer world. Though the forces against Chaos are stronger than ever before, they blew up the world once and there's no reason to believe they couldn't do it again given the chance. In a surprising twist of fate, the Chaos Dwarfs are back in the sequel. According to recent lore, their god Hashut was the reason Grimnir and Grugni were chained to that mountain all the way at the beginning. According to the new Chorfs themselves, this was because they kept tricking him and making fun of him, so he made them go a little crazy, but Grugni was able to chain the two gods up before they started smashing too many things. He also dove into the realm of Chaos and came out far stronger than ever before, and this entire story claims that he's actually one of the ancestor gods of the dwarfs now. Supposedly he was ultimately defeated by Valaya at the cost of her own life, and this entire myth is incredibly interesting. Was Hashut, for instance, actually a purely dwarf god all along, even back in Warhammer Fantasy? Did his nature change for this to be the case when Age of Sigmar occurred, as the potential eons between fantasy and it caused things to blur? Other returning dwarf characters are so old now that they no longer remember their relationship to each other in Age of Sigmar. Who's to say something similar didn't happen to Hashut? Or is the simplest explanation true, and the person who spoke of this myth and or Hashut just full of shit shit and made it all up. That last one seems likely, but rather notably, nothing outright disproves this story's existence. Grimnir and Grugni never spoke of what chained them to the mountain. While it being the total truth is almost certainly not correct, there being kernels of truth in it is rather likely. As for the new Chorfs themselves, they're much the same. They've got a penchant for making weapons with demons bound into them, they're dwarfs, so their craftsdwarfship is still of the highest quality, and they love themselves some slaves. Many of them came about during the Age of Chaos, but whereas the Kharadron went up, these dwarfs went down. They figured they could just seal off the entrances to the upper holds and deal with the demons below and then hunker down. But between dead demons and their own runic magic, they somehow discovered how to turn demons into fuel. Hashut began to whisper to them in the darkness of the lowest parts of their holds, and in their desperation they followed his instructions and eventually became the Chaos Dwarfs Reborn. In what is either the height of dwarf ingenuity or the height of dwarf arrogance, they even claim to have mastered chaos itself. Whether or not this is true, when they first began appearing, rival chaos forces watched them extremely warily. Mastering hell or not, they were clearly good at least controlling it a bit, and no demon wants to be shoved into an artillery cannon for all time. The Chaos Dwarfs expand slowly and out of the eyes of others as often as they can. A raid here, a conquered city there, never too much, for the slow and steady advance of Hashut's Chosen can and should take all the time it needs. There'll always be enemies to fight, so why throw yourself into the meat grinder off rip? They did speed up their various efforts in recent times, which translates to GW finally making them an official army, but all that means is we can actually see them do things now. So if you like ancient Babylonia, dwarfs with an evil twist, and bulls, the Helsmiths of Hashut are great for you. I faintly remember hearing someone mention that it's stupid that people say the Skaven are the same between Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy, and that fantasy players should learn to stop doing that. I can't help but wonder what lore they were reading, or what they were smoking, and where I could get some of it, because the funny rats are still the funny rats. Thankful is even still here, being our favorite murderous and incompetent idiot. This opinion was spoken by someone on Twitter, however, which is where logic and reason go to die, so maybe I shouldn't be surprised. The former clans from Warhammer Fantasy are now types of clans, they now outnumber everyone else even more exponentially than before, and of course they have all new kits and models, especially as of recently. But the Skaven are still the Skaven, an all-consuming, all-selfish horde of maniacal ratmen who wish to see all other races brought low before the Skaven, and all other Skaven brought low before each particular Skaven. Skavenblight is even still here, albeit now renamed Blight City. It used to exist entirely in the Warp, then the Skaven dug so deeply through the infinite realm of chaos that it crashed partially back into the real world. They dig tunnels between realities that sometimes Skaven just get lost in between and never emerge back out of. This doesn't stop them digging more, of course, because a few thousand dead Skaven slaves is something that would have happened eventually anyways. But they're also, of course, still hated by everyone, even the other Chaos forces who somehow hate the Great Horned Rat even more than the rest of the gods. Though eventually Archaon did receive his blessing, the first time the Great Horned Rat tried, Archaon spat in his face. He's that disrespected. The clan's pestilence sometimes have a very tenuous alliance with the forces of Nurgle, but it's an alliance involving the Skaven. They still fight all the time, backstab more often than not, and no one will be surprised when it completely falters. They also continue on with their trend of accidentally ruining things for everyone else when their own schemes either go wrong or sometimes go right. They in part stop NAGASH from having the spotlight by detonating nuclear warheads on some of his pyramids. They reveal the Idoneth Deepkin to NAGASH when they accidentally drained an entire ocean and flooded Skavenblight with it, and by the way, said ocean also contains zombies that started eating Skaven. Thankwell was involved, before you ask. And for their latest crowning achievement in ruining things for everyone else, 4th edition and the Vermin Doom. Chaos has a lot of plans at any given moment. All the factions do, of course, but Chaos had over the course of the game's narrative been crafting more and more schemes to halt Sigmar and reverse all the progress Order had gained. And then the Skaven came in screaming for someone to take their beer and proceeded to crash Skavenblight into all 8 of the mortal realms at once. Somehow. The funny thing is, Archaon said this was fine for them to do, and no other Chaos faction should march against them en masse because of it. The Skaven just keep getting away with their nonsense, you can never stop them. As they were in fantasy, the Skaven continue on being the greatest army GW has ever created. Rats are suddenly even more everywhere than before, and with all new toys to play with. Praise be to the Great Horned Rat, so if you just want to be an asshole more than anything else, then the Skaven are still going strong, in spite of everyone else really wishing they'd all just die already. The Beastmen, or Beasts of Chaos, used to be an army. They used to actually seem to be given better treatment by GW and AOS, with a logic plague that could turn you into a Beastman if you heard about it, and Morgur becoming a minor Chaos god. And then they teased the model for what would turn out to become Kragnos. Beastman players were excited, for that is a creature that clearly belongs to the Beastmen. But no, he's a Grand Alliance destruction model. Then the Old World came out. Fantasy was back. Good times. But not for Beasts of Chaos players, who were informed they now had to rebase their armies back onto squares. Differently sized squares this time compared to old Fantasy, which, while a nice choice because rank and flake models can be hard to squeeze together sometimes, was still another massive kick in the testicles to Beastmen players. I think Morgur was even finally permanently killed in their last bit of lore to explain what happened to them. I'm so sorry, Beastmen players. You don't deserve what GW does to you. Your original game blew up, and then you were informed almost a decade down the line that it was actually back, but now you had no choice but to go back to it. Say it with me now, everyone, because you can't talk about necromancy and undeath and Warhammer without saying the line. Such is the power of Nagash. In between the universes blowing up, Nagash survived. The dude invented necromancy, of course he survived. He was imprisoned, however, unable to free himself until Sigmar came along and let him out. Why he did this is likely because Sigmar needed allies and Nagash was powerful. Why Sigmar didn't go with another death god instead of history's greatest non-Skaven asshole is a question that almost no one can answer, however. But with Nagash now free, he promptly ate almost all the other death gods that used to exist and claimed Shyish as his own. He was actually the last being to leave the original pantheon of gods Sigmar formed in an astonishing twist of fate. He unsurprisingly did this by abandoning Sigmar right as Archaon was invading and eating some of his army for good measure. Sigmar chased him all the way to the Realm of Death, realized he forgot Archaon was invading and turned around, and Nagash was officially on his own. He tried to fight Archaon and got absolutely bodied, in the sense that his body was utterly destroyed, as were his armies. But as the god of death and an inventor of necromancy, death doesn't stick for him, so he just wandered back home. Chaos still overran Shyish though, which, fun fact, Nagash's treatment of his subjects was so shit that many people found chaos control and joining a cult to be a better life. There are living people in the realm of the dead, incidentally. They're typically a bit gloomy, although I imagine some amount of joy can be found after a family member or friend passes, and you can theoretically just go walk down the road a bit to keep talking to them. When the Stormcast rode forth, so too did Nagash again, but of course he's an evil dick, so he also attacked the non-chaotic living. The dead marched across the land, attacking all who they found, reclaiming lost territory in the name of Nagash. As the supreme god of undeath, he has pretty firm control over all things dead. There will be a lot of passages you might read in Age of Sigmar about how X-faction ruler or god receives the souls of their followers upon their deaths. The Stormcast, of course, are the most prominent example, but some others have this as well. It's important to keep in mind that this is not the standard. Most people die and end up in the afterlife their society believes in the realm of death, into Nagash's waiting clutches to be used as he sees fit. Be they zombie, vampire, ghost, or what have ya, all ultimately fall under Nagash's clutches. And while Khorne benefits from the endless amount of blood spilled, so too does Nagash benefit from the endless dead that bloodshed creates. For a decent while in the game's history, there was an event called the Necroquake, followed by the Souls Wars. Nagash did one of his classic plans to try and obtain ultimate power and bend all of reality to his will. You know, boring stuff like that. It failed because of Skaven nukes, but it created a black hole in reality he can use to temporarily boost his power to insane levels. That's what failure is for Nagash, ladies and gentlemen. While his body was destroyed by Teclis again, and the Necroquake ended by Alariel, Nagash's forces are as inevitable as the grave itself. He'll come to prominence once again, and in the meantime his forces will continue the relentless march across the realms. Such is his power. This army is the most obvious continuation of the vampire counts of old. Most of the death factions took a section of that army, split them off, and expanded them into being their own thing. But the Soulblight are the most obvious because that's where the vampires and zombies went. The vampires of Age of Sigmar have undergone some rather significant changes, at least for the circumstances they find themselves in. While the Soulblight curse still makes you a vampire, they're not some pseudo-vampire but not really kind of deal. They're in a position unlike any before, permanently under Nagash's heel. Vampires in fantasy were largely autonomous in the grand scheme of things. A given vampire might be a thrall to their sire, but there was no final authority at the top for all vampires. In Age of Sigmar, however, Nagash is always waiting for them at the top, and he only reintroduced vampires to the mortal realms because even he had to admit he couldn't be everywhere at once. They constantly seek a way to break free of Nagash because of this, and with recent lore of Nagash being on the back foot, many have started doing so far more brazenly. Time will tell if it goes anywhere though, for Nagash is essentially impossible to kill. The various necromancers and whatnot in the Soulblight must deal with a similar issue. Nagash doesn't like people muscling in on his turf, and as such, necromancers are tolerated only barely. That's not to say that they're completely agentless. The head vampires of Mannfred and Neferata plot their own endless schemes, and the lesser ones as well have their own labyrinthine networks of followers, thralls, and more across all the realities of the setting. Just because Nagash is at the top doesn't mean that those under him don't have their own schemes and agency. They just need to play it safe sometimes to avoid getting glassed by the Bone Pope. It's kind of like if in Vampire the Masquerade, Khaine was actively wandering around slaughtering any vampire that called him a bitch, and actively waging war against the US government. And as far as the average mortal sees things, they don't know that all vampires are ultimately bound in Nagash and have to find ways of keeping themselves out of his wrathful gaze and preventing the worst bits of the Soulblight curse from turning them into nothing but savage monsters. They only see the midnight aristocracy reborn into a new reality, sending forth legions of the dead to conquer their cattle. Some Soulblight are nice-ish to mortals, some view them as cattle, like I just said, and some are brutal warlords, subjugating all under them into the most horrid slavery imaginable. Necromantic magics drain the souls of their underlings, and the zombies and skeletons under them are endless in number. With quality on the top in the form of the vampires and wights, quantity below them with the skeletons, zombies, and countless horrific creatures, if you want classic undead fun, you can do no better than these guys. As a final fun fact, apparently vampires cannot drink blood from a Stormcast Eternal. It fills them with lightning and electrocutes them like a Tom and Jerry skit, which is incredibly funny. Ghosts have always been around in Warhammer. In Age of Sigmar specifically, the first time the Nighthaunt were a thing was during the Age of Chaos. Nagash raised the spirits of the dead to fight chaos, and in terms of them being absolute blenders of the living, they were successful. They became far more prominent during the Necroquake when death magic was absolutely everywhere, but with their increased numbers came the revelation of the true problem. Turns out they were almost completely uncontrollable. When you bring forth ghosts that know nothing but hate for the living, they'll kill the living until they run out of targets, and then meander about till they either dissipate or find more targets. So we found a lady that pissed him off, Lady Allender, and put her in charge to make them a proper army. When the Necroquake ended, the Nighthaunt were perhaps the most weakened Death Army, but they still retain a decent amount of autonomy and leadership they lacked previously. Nighthaunt are spooky ghosts through and through, and of course they're tormented souls on top of that. A large amount of Nighthaunt are turned into Nighthaunt to pay for crimes they committed as well, furthering that whole tortured angle. Of course, Nagash is the one deciding if you committed a crime, which means it can range from anything to actual horrific murderer to you annoyed him one day as the cause for becoming a tortured ghost for all eternity. Dreadscythe Harridans, for example, were doctors and healers, doing their best to keep people alive in the violent world of Age of Sigmar. This means they committed the crime of delaying when Nagash would receive people's souls, so he cursed them to be trapped in their ethereal bodies that were repurposed to slaughter all living around them. They can do nothing to stop this, and they're aware of it the whole time. Ghosts as an army is a pretty self-explanatory thing to see if you like them or not. If you like ghosts, you'll probably like the Nighthaunt. They're ghosts. That said, here's some extra recommendations on my part to make enjoying them all the better. Playing either songs from the band Ghosts or What's New Scooby-Doo on an endless loop during a match is perfect for this army. Also be sure to grab Ulrich the Drowner. His rules are decent and his model is amazing, but the real fun is playing Tibia Mariner as a model in a Warhammer game. Funny Boatman was great to see in Elden Ring, and now he can be great here. Some vampires are worse off than others. Poor Usharan is perhaps worst off of all. In old fantasy, he was one of few vampires to regularly try and do good, and he was rewarded with about 5,000 years of consecutive kicks to the sack for his efforts. When he was brought back in Age of Sigmar by Nagash to spread vampirism, he pissed off Nagash at one point and was locked in a cage. Supposedly, this was because of a great betrayal where Usharan waged war against Nagash with endless armies of semi-sane ghoul retainers. I believe the second half of that sentence, but methinks Nagash just decided Usharan deserved more sack taps rather than him actually doing anything wrong. When Usharan was accidentally freed by Sigmar, he'd gone so insane that his delusions are now contagious, and after enough time, the Flesheater Courts were born. His madness only growing worse, Usharan's mere presence, as well as that of powerful enough ghouls, spread this plague of insanity across the mortal realms. To each afflicted ghoul of the courts, they see themselves as noble, chivalrous knights or other heroic sorts. defending the land from terrors and ensuring that those not as mighty as them are able to survive another day. To everyone else, they're insane cannibalistic ghouls. When they meet a champion of order, for instance, in their eyes they may politely invite them for a feast to honor a visit by such a noble guest. When they meet a Chaos Lord, they may in their minds be challenging them to a duel in order to defeat such a curse upon the lands, or at least buy time for other heroes to arrive. In practice for both these situations, they're likely just waving around a severed arm and screeching at the other dude. It's sad more than anything ultimately, but they're also violent cannibals, so it's hard to feel bad for them. If anything, I liken it to feeling bad for a rabid dog. Know the dog doesn't deserve it, and know you aren't happy about what has to be done, but putting it down is about all that's left. In some ways it's worse, but thankfully also cooler, such as how their madness is so extreme it affects reality. If a ghoul picks up a shard of glass it thinks is a telescope or a pocket watch, they will be able to see it as such and correctly use it as such. It isn't, but in their minds it is, and as such they can use it as if it were. Kind of like orc belief in 40k, but this time it's entirely one-sided. Two ghoul kings of equal status may duel, which again to outsiders is just screeching and clawing, but in their minds it is an honorable tournament or something, and the winning ghoul will usually subsume the other ghoul's retainers into their court. And because the madness of powerful ghouls is so potent, it not only is shared with their underlings, but in the newly conquered ghouls under them. It's really cool, albeit in a sad and violent way. In AOS, you can be so insane that other people who are also insane see the world exactly as you do. The ghouls can break free of their madness, but this usually isn't a happy ending. The best case is Ushran himself, who sometimes is lucid before slipping back into his own delusions. As for lesser ghouls, that's almost always a tragedy. Being in the presence of sufficiently powerful beings such as gods, being somehow forced into a situation their delusions can't account for, or just sometimes at random, a member of the Flesheater Courts might break free of their madness. In this case, the reality of what they've actually been doing the whole time hits them all at once, whereupon they almost always slip back into their delusions. This army is very sad to think about, but playing an army of delusional cannibals that think they're all royal knights is pretty kick-ass in a brutal way, and Ushran's new model is disgustingly good looking, easily one of the best GW has ever put out. If you think the best way to deal with a Warhammer setting is to live in complete denial over the reality of it, which truth be told isn't a bad way to cope here, then the Flesheater Courts are for you. As a bonus, screeching bloody murder at your opponent when they ask what you're doing next if you play them isn't bad manners, it's just getting into character. Finally, we come to the end. The army is a fitting last one to talk about here, because Benjamin Franklin hit the nail on the head when he said only two things were certain: death and taxes. And with the Ossiarch Bonereapers, those two things are one and the same. Nagash early on in the setting's history apparently had one hell of a construction crew under his control. He had built massive complexes underneath everyone else's cities, filled with beings constructed using the souls of various people as well as the sculpted bones of various whatever was to hand. Most of them waited in these crypts, but a few early Bonereapers were used on the surface, usually in isolated positions because no one really liked the unnatural beings that they were. Out of universe, these are clearly the Bone Marines to Sigmar's Ground Marines, but in-universe they were down there the whole time awaiting Nagash's call. Then the Necroquake happened, which I'm sure you'll notice is a running theme for the Death Armies as a rather pivotal moment in their history, and as the Soul Wars raged as one, they awoke and marched back to Shyish under Nagash's orders. Why he didn't just have them smash whatever city they were under, I don't know, but it's Nagash, and so if he deemed this was the best course of action, we have no choice but to accept it as such. Techless obliterating Nagash hit them the hardest in some ways, as during the fighting, Eltharion the Grim took revenge on Arkan the Black for his death in Warhammer Fantasy by chucking Eltharion into the void between realms. Though the Ossiarch conquered part of Archaon's personal stronghold, it's been a grueling defensive battle ever since for them, and without Nagash and Arkan's guidance, they are to some extent floundering harder than any other Death faction. But they're highly disciplined and most likely already working on getting Arkan back, and if anyone can hold the line in the meantime, it's them. As for the day-to-day life of a Bone Reaper, it's the IRS. When they set up shop in an area, the Bone Reapers go around to local settlements and inform them that they all have a tithe to pay. It's paid by simply handing them over bones, so you better get digging up those graves. If you pay the tithe, they thank you and return next year for the next one. If you don't, that's no worry at all. Your own bones will do just as well as Grandma Dearest would have, so hand over that leg. Then they combine various souls and bones into one super being who is equal parts warrior, poet, artist, and whatever else the sculptor felt like throwing in. In perhaps this faction alone, we have what society under Nagash, if he were to win, might look like. Completely undead, so obviously not the liveliest of places, but there may indeed be true civilization even in an eternal afterlife ruled by him. They're good fun as an army, and I'd recommend you pick them up. If nothing else, their deal boxes usually have 1,000,000 of their basic infantry in each, so whenever one comes around, give it a grab. If you don't, then you'll have no choice but to be on the receiving end of the Bone Marines when it's tithe time. And that was every army in Warhammer Age of Sigmar. My voice hurts now, so I'm going to go away. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Sigmar to my Age of, and while I don't even know what the hell I'm talking about right now, I thank you for your support nonetheless. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Did you know GW plans to introduce another 10 armies into Age of Sigmar? Seems like 24 as they have now wasn't enough for them, and they even made it an official corporate policy to get this done as soon as possible. Look up Age of Sigmar Rule 34 for more information on this.